Nelms. I'm the CEO of Work Institute, and thank you, if I can get my talking working this morning, for joining our webinar today, How Employers Cause the Great Resignation. I want to encourage everyone to ask questions throughout the webinar. You can use your Q&A box on the webinar panel to simply ask a question. I'll be monitoring those throughout, and we'll try and take a few pauses to answer questions as we go along. But we got a lot to get to today. Clearly, a lot has been going on over the last 2 years. And for those of you that look forward to seeing our retention reports on an annual basis, this is our 6th year, I believe, of doing our annual retention report. We were a little late this year getting it out because clearly there was a lot to evaluate. There was a lot to analyze. A lot of things have happened in 2020 and 2021, and we wanted to make sure that we brought all of that information to bear in our retention report, or at least as much as we could. And I think we brought some new insights for those of you that have been watching our retention reports and reading and learning from them over the years. So extremely glad to be presenting the 2022 report to you today. So as is typical, we always like to first just take a look at the state of the workforce, what's going on, what were the workforce dynamics, the workforce economics that were at play last year in 2021, and certainly we'll talk a little bit about how they're continuing to impact the workplace, certainly in 2022, but let's jump right into it. So the Great Resignation is absolutely real. This is our chart where we're tracking voluntary turnover going all the way back to 2002. That was the earliest year that the Bureau of Labor Statistics actually tracked this metric. And we saw from 2002 until 2008, 2009, yeah, there was a little bit of volatility there. We saw that in 2003, 2004, the number of open jobs were going up, and that was certainly creating some voluntary turnover. And of course, we had the big recession in 2009, and we've really seen a steady increase all the way through just to pre-pandemic around 2019, where voluntary turnover was absolutely on the rise. Not surprisingly, in 2020, that voluntary turnover went down. But what we have seen in what we saw in 2021 was just unprecedented. The number of voluntary turnover people that have left voluntarily has actually doubled, almost doubled since 2011. Just a massive number of people that are choosing to leave their jobs and go to work somewhere else. And it is causing significant disruption for employers. There are very few employers that I talk to on a day in and day out basis that aren't feeling the effects of this massive resignation era and people leaving voluntarily. And it has not slowed in 2022. I was just looking at the numbers this morning. Already just through April, which is all that the Bureau of Labor Statistics has reported, we've already had 17 million plus employees leave their jobs voluntarily, which is like 4 million more than that same period last year in 2021. So the Great Resignation just continues to roll on, and employees are deciding that somewhere else is a better opportunity, and they're choosing to take those opportunities. And this is really, if you want to say it, this is part of the cause, although there is a greater cause. Obviously, we talk about that in terms of employers being the cause, but certainly the underlying conditions have not helped employers. The little circle here obviously is the inflection point where we saw that the percentage of job openings actually exceeds those that are unemployed. And we saw that happen just prior to like 2017, 2018. There was a point in there where we saw that. But if you look back in 2019, you saw that certainly there were more jobs than unemployed, but see, the gap was not, significant. We're talking maybe a few million people that gap existed. And then obviously, just as the pandemic hit, those lines crossed and we had a lot more unemployed people than we had open jobs. The open jobs surprisingly did not dip quite as much. I think we went from somewhere around 10 million to somewhere around 7 million open jobs. But we've seen those open jobs just continue to grow and they're sitting somewhere between 10 and 11 million on a monthly basis. But now that gap has widened significantly. So we've got a lot more open jobs than we had unemployed people. And so we have to attract employees from other employers. And that's really where these dynamics are coming from, is that employers continue to have to step up their games in order to recruit employees. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem that they're stepping up their game to retain the employees that they have. And when I say that employers caused the Great Resignation, this is a huge part of it. I mean, we hear this on a daily basis, that so much is being invested in recruiting employees. We recruit, we add recruiters, we do all these things to try and bring people in the door. All the while, employees are voluntarily quitting. And so, there's a hole in the bottom of the bucket that employers just don't seem to be willing to try and plug while they're investing all of their resources into hiring employees. And this is just a challenge, and employers have got to start looking at this in a different way, or this trend is going to continue. It's just something that we have to change the dynamics of in the workplace. And employers have to step up. They have to think about this differently. We've already talked a little bit about unemployment. Obviously, we saw unemployment go down dramatically. We're sitting at around 3.6%. What I want to point out here, though, is that pre-recession of 2008, 2009, look how long it took unemployment to decline and get to sort of that 4%, 3.5%, 4%. We saw this massive spike with the pandemic, where unemployment reached 14.5%, almost 15. But we've seen a dramatic fall. And in some ways, this is not surprising, because we know that the economic recession that we had was largely fueled by the pandemic. And as we've started to be able to live more effectively with COVID and with the effects of a global pandemic, then certainly we saw the economic indicators start to realign themselves. And so that unemployment dropped very quickly. But I think this is also a little bit of shock to employers. I think it's a shock to the system, right? There was, in other recessionary environments, there was a much longer tail to getting employees back employed. Certainly in most cases, we didn't have near the number of open jobs. So the dynamics of this time frame have just been vastly different than other recessionary periods that we've had. But one of the things that we continue to hear is that there are employees sitting on the sidelines. And the labor force participation rate just doesn't really bear that out. Workers that are not in the labor force who want a job, we saw that obviously spiked in the wake of the pandemic, but that line has quickly gone down. And we've probably got somewhere between 1 million, maybe upwards of 2 million in some instances of employees that are not in the labor force who want a job. And that's pretty much reflected in our unemployment rate. But I don't think there's a lot of employees at this point that are on the sidelines. Where we really felt the impact of this in terms of just the overall available labor force was the fact that we had almost 5 million people retire, just completely exit the workforce due to retirement over the course of about 18 months. Very sadly, we've had over 1 million people who died due to complications from COVID. And so, you've got 6 million people that are no longer in the workforce due to retirement or due to, unfortunately, dying due to COVID. And that has put also this undue stress into the economic conditions and the workforce conditions. So everything is stacking up, if you will, to some degree against employers. But those are just the conditions that exist. But again, we're seeing indications that employers are not stepping up continually in the way that we certainly saw at one stage. The other thing that we've talked about for years, and we haven't included in our retention report for the last couple of years, is just looking at just how costly the Great Resignation has been to employers. We use a very conservative estimate of cost to turnover. We look at 33% of base pay. Right now, employees on average are at about 45,000 across the US, although that certainly is growing. So we typically use a conservative $15,000 per employee. And that would indicate that there was over 700 million in cost of 700 billion, excuse me, in cost of turnover to employers. And I also think this is one of the metrics that most employers are not paying close enough attention to. I repeatedly run into HR professionals and other leaders in organizations, and they talk about their high turnover. One of the questions I almost always ask are they tracking that cost of turnover? And the vast majority of the time, the answer that I get is no, we're not. And this is one of the reasons I think that it doesn't draw enough attention of our C-suite. I think they don't see the cost. And I've often talked about cost of turnover as being likened to sort of high blood pressure. They talk about high blood pressure being the silent killer. And I think in this case, the cost of turnover are the silent killer of profitability in organizations. We're certainly hearing more and more about profits being a concern for companies across the US. There are even talks that we may be entering some recessionary period. Certainly, we're hoping that's not the case. Obviously, it's fueled by some of the inflation factors that are going on. But the employers are experiencing so much cost and turnover. And again, it's buried in that profit and loss statement. It's buried in the number of recruiters we're hiring. It's buried in the number of drug screens we're doing and background checks that we're doing. It's buried in the time it takes to interview people. It's buried in all of those things that are having to occur due to the fact that we're losing so many employees and having to hire so many employees, that the cost is just outrageous. And if we're not tracking those costs and looking at it appropriately, then it's not getting the attention that it deserves and that it needs in order to start to plug that hole that's in the bottom of the bucket. So much of the investment is going towards hiring versus how can that investment be turned and try and figure out how do we actually keep the employees that we have. So those are really just a quick look at the economic and workforce economic conditions that we've experienced over the last couple of years. Again, if you look into 2022, those numbers really have not changed dramatically. Our report only goes through the end of 21. But again, we have a high number of open jobs. We've still got low unemployment. Labor force participation is working its way down, or excuse me, up in terms of the number of people that are participating. But unfortunately, we still just have a lower number of available people to enter the workforce. And so all of those conditions are certainly making things very difficult. So obviously, one of the highlights of our annual retention report is looking at a deep dive around why employees are leaving. And I always want to just make a special note here is that we conduct exit interviews for somewhere in the neighborhood of 30,000 departing employees every year. That is a very, very large data set. It's a very diverse data set. About half are salaried employees, about half are hourly employees. So we think this is one of, if not the largest normative data sets that exist in terms of why employees are leaving. The other note I always like to make is that this is the most sound methodology used that we're aware of in collecting this data. Some 80% of exit interviews that are conducted are actually conducted on or before the last day of employment. And we find that if they're conducted at least 2 weeks after, that some 40% of the reasons for leaving will actually be different or change. So, and we've all talked about the reasons why, correct? We've talked about how people don't want to burn a bridge. They don't want to throw their manager under the bus. They just don't feel comfortable before they've left their employer to tell them the truth. And so a lot of times what we see is when other organizations come out with their reasons for leaving, they're actually pretty different than ours. And when we look closer, we find that their collection methods are very different than ours. But we rely on research. We rely on sound research in terms of how we conduct our exit interviews. So we believe that this is by far the most accurate normative database that exists in terms of reasons for leaving. So not surprising, but career reasons continue to be the #1 reason why employees leave. This has been true for 12 years and continues to be true. Some 22% or 1 in 5 employees actually cite career as the reason that they've left their job. Something that's actually increased over the last year is the job reasons, and we're going to get into that in just a little bit more detail. Health and family reasons come in third. Work-life balance reasons come fourth. It's not till #5 that we get to total rewards, which includes base pay. And I feel like a broken record. I really do, because we point this out year in and year out, that the narrative always exists within companies that employees are leaving for pay. And the data just never backs that up. Less than 1 in 10 employees actually cite the pay as the root cause of why they left. And we're going to talk a lot more about pay as we move along today in this webinar. But those are the top reasons why employees are actually choosing to leave their jobs. It's always important to look at different segmentations and different views of reasons for leaving. This is actually a new view that we've added this year. The methodology that we use for collecting exit interviews is that we don't just require our interviewees to select a reason for leaving. We actually ask them to tell us all the reasons that impacted why they left. So many employees will give us 2, 3, even up to 4 reasons why they chose to leave their job. But then we actually ask them to give us the most important reason. So what this chart is showing us is that if we look at all reasons versus the most important reasons, and just a couple of things that I want to point out. For example, pay. If we look at all reasons, it was a factor more often than not. But when we go to the most important reasons, that pay issue goes down. Versus in career, when it's not a factor for all reasons as frequently as it is for the most important reasons. Where this is practical in organizations is that we actually have a client that pointed this out themselves more recently, is when they look at all the reasons why employees leave, pay is #2. But when they filter that and look at just the most important reasons, then pay suddenly goes down to #5. So, pay can be a factor in employees leaving, but it's not the most important factor. And unfortunately, some of the methodologies that are used out there are just collecting that all reasons, and they're elevating pay as an issue as opposed to looking at what is the root cause or what is the most important reason. And I think this is an important thing for organizations to be doing, is if your methodology is asking for all the reasons why employees leave, you can actually get kind of some false readings about what the root cause are, because the numbers just don't add up. So even if you are doing them internally, or if you're doing them through some online survey and you're asking for all reasons, you have to follow that up with which of these reasons is most important. It's extremely important that you do that so that you can filter through the noise of all the reasons why employees are giving you versus what are the things that are most important to them. In terms of trends, there's just a couple of things to point out here. Obviously, the big trend is in career reasons. And there's a couple of interesting factors that I want to talk about in just a minute. But we saw that during the 2020 pandemic year, career reasons went down, but they've shot up significantly. And now they're well outpacing what we even saw in 2019. Cultural reasons have continued to decline. We've got just general employment. Someone actually is asking the question, what falls into general employment? Honestly, this is kind of a miscellaneous column, for, a code for us. It's when things don't fall in any of these other 10 categories. It's sort of a catch-all when it can't really be defined by any of the others. So that's where we just call it general employment, and you can see the percentages are quite low. And so generally it's not a factor with employers, but it's kind of our miscellaneous because it doesn't easily code into any of the other categories that we have. Health and family reasons, obviously we saw during the pandemic year that number went up. We know all the reasons why, because of COVID, because of kids having to be having remote schooling. Certainly health conditions were a factor in a lot of this. So we saw those health and family reasons rise. They have certainly started to decline, not quite to the level that we saw pre-pandemic or in 2019, but they certainly are going down. The other one that is actually going up is total rewards. So I'm going to jump across, and total rewards are going up in terms of a factor for leaving or reasons for leaving. But notice it's a little higher than 2019, but not substantially. And again, it's less than 1 in 10 employees are leaving for pay reasons. The other big issue, I think, is work-life balance. We're seeing those numbers continue to decline. And the primary reason we're seeing those decline is the huge introduction of hybrid work environments or work from home circumstances. People are wanting what we call work-life integration. They're wanting a higher degree of work-life integration. And some of the now work circumstances that are being presented by employers are actually allowing employees to do a better job related to that work-life integration. And so we're seeing the work-life balance issues decline. So those are some of the key trends that we saw, certainly going from 2019 to 2021. I don't think that they're overly surprising. I'm not surprised to see pay going up, but it's certainly not now, it's not the biggest factor in terms of why people are leaving. So when we continue to hear that with employers, 9 times out of 10, it's just false. Our data just simply doesn't back it up. We do look at reasons for leaving based on sex. Again, some things here that are pretty clear, but see that there are many more males that are looking at their career and are for career reasons. Excuse me, I can't talk this morning, which is a bad thing when you're doing a webinar. But males exceed that versus health and family, where we have females that are actually leaving at much higher rates than males. But everything else is not huge. Total rewards is maybe a little bit surprising, but you do see that males leave at a slightly higher rate than females when it comes to pay. And the work-life balance is a little more prevalent when we look at females versus males. The important thing here, I think, is for companies, for organizations to be looking at these trends. You want to make sure that you don't have conditions that are adversely affecting a particular group of employees. So I don't know that the normative data necessarily tells us a whole lot, but I think that it's important for organizations to be looking at this data specifically. And so that you're understanding what might be affecting males versus females. And that goes for other ethnicities as well, wanting to make sure that you've got all of that information at your fingertips so that you're addressing issues that are appropriate. One of the things that I always like to look at is actually this chart, because we look at this as it relates to age. We can call this the generations if you want. We don't choose to look at it that way. We typically think about it more in terms of early career, mid-career, and late career. And so you can see that in early career, career is more important. I don't think that's surprising. And that as people get older, career becomes less of a factor. But look at culture. When we look at environment, which is primarily a cultural measurement for employers, those things become much more important as employees get older. And so, a lot of people talk about how millennials or Gen X or Gen Z or all of those, and how they're so attached to, culture and some of the perks and all those things. But this doesn't bear that out really in terms of what the data actually tells us. Few of the others, when we look at health and family, it's pretty prevalent across all age factors. Certainly involuntary is the same way. The job factors actually increase as people get older. And I think where that comes into play is that as employees age, they certainly have a good, strong idea of what kind of job that they actually want, and want to make sure that the job fits their their wants and their desires. We see that they expect more from their managers. And so they're willing to leave to go to work for someone that they want to work for more in terms of managers. Relocation goes down over time. We certainly see this huge spike in retirement. But look at total rewards. It's really not that different for different age groups, nor is work-life balance. And I think that's really where we tend to have this myth that younger workers are, tied to this idea of work-life balance, and that they're desperately looking for it and they're going to leave if they don't have it. And we see that that's pretty consistent across all of the different age groups. So we have a question that comes in. This data is derived from employers and employees in the US. In your experience, is the Europe job market closely aligned to the US in terms of what the data tells us? I actually got this question recently as well, and I don't know the answer. I'm just going to be real transparent here. We know that the job market in general in Europe is a little bit differently. We do have some clients that have talked to us about seeing evidence of the Great Resignation in other countries. Certainly some of that in Mexico is occurring. We're seeing similar trends in Canada. But in terms of some of the European countries, I don't have as easily accessible data, so I'm just not real sure. I think this is Philip. Philip, if you want to follow it with me after the webinar, maybe later this week or next week, I need to look into that data a little bit closer and see what it says. So maybe we can explore that together. The last thing I want to look at is tenure. Again, just how long somebody's been in the job. I don't know that this is terribly surprising. As people are in their job a little bit longer, career issues become a little bit more important. The job is something that early on, with a year or less of tenure, that they leave for more commonly. I believe this is a recruiting issue. I believe that we're not often giving a realistic job preview. And so people get into the job and realize that it's not what they expected. So they leave at a higher rate. Certainly, we see that as people have been there longer, they retire at a much higher rate. And then the work-life balance. We do see a much higher rate of work-life balance issues in the years 1 through 3. And again, I think some of this goes back to our hiring process and our realistic job previews, and talking about specifically the schedule and what kind of schedules people are going to have. It's a difficult task, I recognize, for employers, because we've got so many people that are leaving. We oftentimes hire somebody with one idea about what their schedule is going to be or how much they're going to have to work, and then we lose somebody and they have to work more. It's a reality of what exists. But I also think that the communication that we're having between our manager and the employees around these issues is not particularly good. And so I think that we're seeing that they're leaving at a much higher rate. So I want to pause for just a second and again encourage you to submit your questions via the Q&A box, and we'll try and get to those just as quickly as we can. The following slides are all in our annual retention report. And what these slides are and what those graphics are in our retention report is then we break down each category. So we look at reasons for leaving in 2 ways. We look at the categories, which we have the 11 categories that we cited in the slide previously. But within each of those categories, there are sub-themes that we look at. So for example, here in career, we actually have 5 different sub-themes that make up those career reasons. So we have development, we have different career, we have school reasons, we have promotion, and we have job security. And I think for those of you that are conducting exit interviews, again, this is extremely important. We have to be able to look at not just what are the overall themes in these larger categories, but we also need to be able to look at what are those sub-themes and what is the makeup here. I'm not going to go into great detail in all of these slides. Again, they're available to you in the retention report. We are happy to provide these slides to anyone that would like them. But one of the things I wanted to point out here, there has been a lot of media coverage and a lot of talk about employees rethinking their careers during the pandemic and just rethinking their life and what was important to them, and then them pursuing a completely different career. The data does bear that out. It does bear that that is something that did happen. So for the first time, really that different career is higher than development. For years, we've been talking about how important development is and how important investing in your employees and helping them grow in their job is. But what we saw in 2021 was that different career actually outpaced the development. Anecdotally, I will tell you what I hear from companies, though, and certainly we hear it from employees, is that in wanting to explore different careers, and a lot of larger companies in particular, those different careers can exist within that company, but they're not given those opportunities. Either managers are too stubbornly trying to hang on to their employees because they're afraid to lose them and have them move to other departments, or companies simply aren't posting jobs regularly. They're not communicating. And I think maybe the most important thing is that our managers are simply not helping employees to navigate their career within organizations. This is one of the things that we've been talking about really for a couple of years now, because we see manager ratings being predictive of a career reasons for leaving. And really it boils down to how effective are our managers and our supervisors at helping employees to navigate their career. And we've got to be doing a lot better job of helping our managers know how to do this and giving them those skill sets. This is the number one development opportunity I think that exists within companies. And I have yet to hear a company, when I've asked the question, do you help your managers to understand how to help their employees from a career management perspective? And the answer is always no. But when career reasons are the number one reason why people leave, why aren't we investing more in terms of how we as an organization are going to help navigate careers? We just don't do it. And again, I go back to this idea that employers caused the Great Resignation. And there are so many things that are so obvious that employers continue to not do. They're just simply not investing in ways to help employees navigate their career, progress their career if they want, grow in their job if they want. Even things like going back to school, and employers don't work readily with employees around school schedules. Now, is that possible in every job? Of course not. But more times than not, we hear that it would have been possible to coordinate with their school schedules, but they weren't given that opportunity. And so they find themselves having to go somewhere else to work that will, in fact, help them to navigate their school schedule and continue working at the same time. So these are really important things to look at in terms of these sub-themes, and certainly in terms of some of the things that we heard in the mainstream media. There's some of this data that certainly bears out that people did look for different careers. In terms of the job itself, the one noteworthy thing here is workload stress. It's always been one of the major factors in terms of the job reasons for leaving, but we certainly did see that increase in 2021. Obviously, I think it's pretty reflective of the Great Resignation, and too many people were having to do the work of two people or three people instead of just their job. But we also saw a huge rise in the characteristics or the type of work. And so when we talk about the type of work, there's a subtle difference between different career and a different type of work. So a different type of work generally for us is that they're staying within the same kind of job family. So an accountant is still going to be an accountant, but they want a different type of work within that accounting discipline. We see it in healthcare, where you've got a nurse that's working in a hospital and they choose to go into hospice, for example. So it's in the same job family, if you will, but it's a different type of work that they're looking for. And again, we think this is something that employers simply aren't managing effectively. They're not helping to navigate these work characteristics and the things that employees want to do differently. They're not paying close enough attention to them. There's not enough discussions going on about them. And so again, I think employers are falling short here. Noteworthy in terms of health and family is just the fact that we are seeing that decline both in child and elder care. We're seeing it in non-work related health. Work-related health didn't go down quite as much in 2021 as it was in 2020. Certainly, we know we had some lingering effects, especially the mutations of COVID in early 2021. So I think all of those factors played into those health and family reasons and why they didn't decline more in 2021. This, I think, is very noteworthy. Again, we talked about work-life balance reasons declining as a category. And here we see the primary driver of that being that shift schedule. So commute didn't change dramatically from 2020 to 21, but we saw it go down from 2019. We saw work travel actually increase very slightly from 2020 to 2021. I think this is a lot of this is reflective, again, of people that didn't want to travel due to COVID. And if they were being required to travel, they chose to choose another job. But again, those shift schedule reasons have declined substantially since 2019, and we really expect that trend to continue moving forward, although there will become a point where that will certainly level out once everybody kind of settles into the type of work schedule options that employers are going to give employers. Again, we do see this big jump in base pay. We see things like benefits and bonuses and commissions are pretty steady. Those are not major factors in terms of why people leave, but we certainly saw this uptick in base pay. Again, I point out over and over that, again, it represents, less than 1 in 10 employees overall that are leaving for pay reasons. Although in terms of the category, base pay is definitely the biggest reason within total rewards. So we're going to talk a little more about pay in a few minutes. Manager reasons are trending slightly up, but not substantially. I always just want to point out here that professional behavior is the #1 reason why people leave their manager and cite their manager. And again, I don't think we're developing our managers effectively. I don't think we're doing enough to effectively arm our managers to honestly just behave professionally in the workplace. And it's improved a little bit since 2019, but we've got a lot more work to do in this category and things that we need to do for managers that I've talked about a lot in the past. Environment is really around these organizational culture reasons. These, for the most part, organizational culture reasons went down in 2020, and they've stayed pretty consistent into 2021. The other factors, coworkers, the facilities, the physical environment, safety, mission and values, and diversity of all, really all represent less than 2.5% of this category and are not really major factors, but have also not moved substantially over time, other than, again, that safety factor that increased during the pandemic in 2020 and has certainly started to decline. I think that's the thing to take away from this particular slide. So again, I will encourage you to ask any questions that you might have. We ran through those pretty quickly. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, and we go into a lot more detail in the report itself. But these additional insights are really, in some ways, to me, the meat of this webinar, and I wanted to make sure and leave us this 15 minutes or so to really dig into this. So this is something that we have presented in our retention report for the very first time. In our exit interviews, we actually asked the question, are you currently employed? So this is somebody that we know has already left. Are they currently employed? And if yes, we actually asked them, what attracted you to your new employer? I think this is important for a few reasons. One, I think it gives us a roadmap for what we need to be focusing on when we're in the recruiting process, we're pre-hiring process, the things that employees are looking for. They want to be very clear about what those career opportunities are. They want to understand the environment and the culture of the organization. They want to know about the job itself, the total rewards, and certainly the work-life balance. So these are the things that, again, I don't think this is overly surprising, but it's something I think that allows us to focus our efforts in that pre-employment and certainly in our employment branding efforts. But again, those attractors, notice that total rewards is actually the number 2 attractor. It is definitely a reason why people are attracted to other jobs. A little over 20% will say pay was an attractor to the job that they went to. But half of those people, less than half of those people at 9%, actually say it was the root cause of why they left. And I think it's always important to point out here, and again, many of you have heard me speak over the years. You've probably heard me say this over the years. It is very, very unusual for anybody to leave a job and not get a pay raise. It's the norm. Does it happen occasionally that someone takes a pay cut? Sure. But more often than not, when you leave a job, you're going to make more money. And so I think, again, in many cases, when exit interviews are being done the easy way out, either through some sort of web interview or web survey, or HR is doing them before they leave, it's an easy answer. Well, I got a better offer. I got more pay. It's easy to say, it's easy to believe, but again, is that the root cause? Is that the real reason? So even though those 20% will say it attracted them to the job, less than 10% are saying it's the reason why they left. Career reasons are still the number 1 attractor. We've seen that, basically stay steady other than the 2020 pandemic year. We've seen culture become a little bit less of a factor. The job itself became extremely important in 2020, but it leveled back out. So I think the takeaway here, again, is the total rewards. It's the base pay attractor. That's the thing we need to be looking at. But again, it's not why people are leaving. It's what attracts them. But something else is going on. And those are the factors that we have to get to. And we're going to talk a little bit about how we might do that as an employer as we're wrapping up this webinar. One thing I want to point out, and this is a little more tactical for those of you that are listening in today around exit interviews. We have been doing a lot of work over the last 3 to 4 years around all of the items that we look for in terms of ratings in an exit interview. And I think this is largely discounted by employers. I don't think they pay close enough attention to the ratings. Hold on a second. There was a question I need to follow up. There was a follow-up to Philip's question. Is there a sense if the Canadian market is trending similarly to the US? I have talked to some folks in Canada, and there is some indication that there are some parallels between what's going on in the US and what's going on in Canada. I don't think that it's been quite as dramatic in terms of the Great Resignation in Canada, but there has certainly been a higher number of voluntary turnover that has occurred in Canada from what I've been hearing anecdotally. I did an interview with a Canadian reporter a few months ago, and certainly from his research that he'd done, certainly it was going on. And so he was asking me about some of the information that we gather from employers here in the US. Another question, if all unemployed people due to COVID has been reabsorbed, as one of the first slides shows, with this turnover rate, it means that basically we had a reshuffling of the workforce among US companies. If yes, and the turnover continues to be high, it must mean that the economic issues of the US is not ready for what the people are asking. In other words, we have to expect this kind of turnover for a long period in the future. All right, so I think what this person is saying is that the economic conditions are the primary driver and this reshuffling. I'm going to have to disagree. I think the economic conditions play a part, no doubt. I mean, if we don't have a high number of open jobs, certainly it is more difficult to go out and find another job. But when those factors are positive, then the question is, why are employees choosing to leave their current employer? We also saw this, and we don't have a data. We don't have the data to back this up. We don't find out this information per se, but there was some indication that some 50% of employees regretted leaving their employer and going somewhere else last year. The Harvard Business Review, I think, put this out, and so I think what that tells us is that employers thought the grass was going to be greener on the other side, and then it wasn't. which is pretty reflective of what we see from employers. There are just not that many employers that we see that are truly doing a fantastic job. There's so many gaps in terms of how they, what they should be doing as an employer and the things they're not doing. I've got a slide that addresses that in just a couple of minutes, but I don't think this is just economic conditions. What type of employers and careers are used to collect this data? For example, are hospitality workers included? We've got a pretty diverse set. There are some hospitality workers included in this data set. There's healthcare workers, there's manufacturing, we've got pharmaceutical. We feel like when we've compared this to other data sets that have been out there, that again, it is pretty representative across the board. I mean, specifically restaurants within hospitality is a little bit of a tricky one in terms of just the mobility of those workers. And so we encourage anybody that's in that industry that, are they effectively doing exit interviews? What I hear is that especially in restaurant workers, they really don't care because there's not as much cost of turnover because they're generally hiring experienced servers. And so they come in and they just pick up and go forward. So I think that's something that maybe we can take offline and talk a little bit more about, Olivia. So feel free to follow up with me. There's another question, but I want to keep moving for just a minute, and then I'll get to all the questions at the end. I just don't want to be rushed for time. But I think what we have shown is that there's a direct correlation between improving the core driver ratings around organization as an employer, the manager, the team, and the job, and decreasing reasons for leaving. We've shown the predictive nature of these in terms of, the manager, for example, predicts 6 of the categories for leaving. And so what we are always trying to help organizations do is certainly we need to look at the reasons for leaving, but what are some of those underlying factors around the core drivers, the job itself, the manager, the organization as an employer, the team or the people they work with? All of these things need to be looked at in terms of how they're impacting the overall work experience. We look at these in things like engagement surveys. Why aren't we paying more attention to them in the exit interview? And my take is that they're discounted. Again, people say, well, what difference does it make? They've left. Do I really care? But this is important information because of its predictive value. So we really have to be paying attention. And the one thing I wanted to point out here is those fair poor ratings. So we talk about the percent of negative ratings. Look at these numbers. I mean, managers are rated negative 26% of the time, the job 22% of the time, the team 33% of the time. All of these factors come into play, and we've got to be looking at what are those negative factors that are influencing employees, because this contributes to their reason for leaving. So I want to encourage you to really think about what is the information you're gathering in an exit interview, and are you gathering this really important core driver ratings as well? So here is here's the biggie. Here is the big slide. Here is where I really point to when I make the statement, employers cause the Great Resignation. And I just noticed that William, that our title on this is off. So we got to fix that one before we send it out. This is our quarterly NAS trend. So again, we're collecting these core drivers on a quarterly basis from some 5,000 to 7,000 employees on a quarterly basis. What we saw in the wake of the pandemic was in Q2 of 2020, those ratings went up, and they went up pretty dramatically. Company NES score increased 50%, the managers 34%, the team 24%, the job itself 42%. I've been talking to employers for the last year, and I've been digging into our data for the last year. And routinely what we see, for lack of a better word, is that there was an incredible level of care and concern for employees during the immediate after effects of the pandemic. There was massive levels of communication. Managers were setting clear expectations. Managers were checking in with their employees. Everything, there was so much of a focus on employee well-being and being flexible and just this level of caring. And when I've used that word when talking to employers, they've said, you're absolutely right. Well, that kind of continued throughout 2020, although it started to decline. But look what happened in Q2 of 2021. Those numbers cratered. 64% decrease over time in company NES score. The managers hung in there around 2%, 21% decrease in team, 46% decrease in the job itself. This is what I point to when I say employers caused the Great Resignation. The perceptions of employees rose during the pandemic, and then they immediately started to decline, and they really started to decline. And when you look at that Q2 of 2021, and if I were to go back to that supply demand slide that I showed you earlier, that inflection point when there were more available jobs than there were unemployed people coincides with these ratings cratering. Now, some people will say, well, people just gave poor ratings. That's certainly not what we see. You guys are hearing that banging. Somebody's hanging a picture next door. I'm sorry, I got off track. What we have seen in our data and what we've seen from other companies that collect this data is engagement scores went up and then went down. Individual employers, their engagement scores went up and then they went down. So there's a lot of evidence to support the fact that employees just simply saw that there were other opportunities out there, and they did not feel like their employer was going to continue to pay attention to them. They were not giving them the level of care and concern that they had given them previously in the wake of the pandemic. And with other choices available, they're simply going to go somewhere else and try and find another job. This is really why I believe that employers caused the Great Resignation. They showed a glimpse of what they were willing to do, and then they stopped. We showed incredible levels of care and concern, incredible levels of communication. Our managers were doing great things, and then we stopped. Did we stop 100%? No. But have we slacked off? Absolutely. And I think I've yet to hear employers that said that wasn't the case. So we've got to find ways to get back there. I want to go back to this pay issue for just a minute, because again, I think that in the wake of the Great Resignation, that most employers were pointing to pay being the issue. Inflation is as a factor out there. They keep saying that they can't pay enough, that people are getting better offers somewhere else. Again, pay is an attractor. It's one of the things that attracts people to other jobs, but it is not the underlying root cause. And so I can't get into the level of detail here that I would love to. This is probably an entirely different webinar altogether. But this is what our data tells us. It tells us that the employment relationship is complex. It tells us that there's so much to what employees expect. And so I'm just going to rattle through these really quick. Employees expect to be developed. They want to grow and learn in their job. In many cases, they want to see how their career can progress. Many employees want to be able to explore different career paths. Employees want a certain level of work-life integration. Employees want an organization culture that is supportive with an emphasis on mission and values, and they have transparent communication. Employees expect managers and supervisors to understand them as a person, provide support, set clear expectations, and treat them professionally. Employees want an employer that emphasizes their well-being as a person and understands the demands that often come with caring for family members. And yes, employees want to be paid competitively and fairly for the work they do. Employment is a difficult thing. Having employees is not easy. We hear that all the time from managers. If I just didn't have to have employees, companies say, if we just didn't have to have employees. Well, guess what? We have to have employees. That's what makes the world go round. That's what makes us be able to produce the services and the goods that we do that keep the economy rolling. But we've got to start to look at this employment relationship in a much more complex way. If we are just looking at pay, or we're just looking at, they leave managers, they don't leave companies. If we're continuing to just paint broad brushes around this retention effort, we're not getting to the root cause. We're not understanding the complexity of the relationship, and we're not spending enough time on it. So what do? right now, organizations, in my opinion, must know the real reasons employees are leaving and what risk factors are causing employees to consider leaving. High quality exit and stay interviews are necessary to understand the why employees leave and the risk as to why they might consider leaving. If you're not doing a high quality exit interview, and I would tell you that in my opinion and with my research, that high quality means using an outside third party, doing that exit interview after they've left, and possibly doing it telephonically if possible. If that's not what you're doing, you need to start considering it now, because otherwise the data that you're gathering about why your employee's leaving is likely wrong. Stay interviews are critical right now. We've got to be training our managers to do stay interviews, or you got to be hiring an outside third party to conduct stay interviews, because those risk factors are real and we have to know what those are so that we can try and intervene before employees leave. Organizations and managers stepped up, as I've said, in the wake of the difficult circumstances of the global pandemic. We got to figure out how to revitalize those efforts. We got to evaluate our leadership models, and we've got to apply our leadership models to the current conditions. I think we're still teaching leadership from 5-year, 10-year models. We've got to get back to what are the current conditions. They've changed. They're different. We live in a different world today than we did 3 years ago. And are we thinking about the employment relationship the same, or are we thinking about it differently? Are we thinking about how we train our managers, our supervisors in the same way we used to? Or are we adding the key elements that are factors for why employees are leaving now? And you must assign costs to both the actual turnover and the turnover risk. If you're not looking at this through a financial lens, your executives are not going to be paying attention. So there was one other question. Actually, we're putting in place a lot of initiatives of caring plus salary increases, but our turnover doesn't decrease. Maybe it's not only the employer's fault, but just a new approach of the people towards work world. Well, I mean, I think there's what are those initiatives? And I can tell you that salary increases alone, we see it over and over again. When we increase salaries, we get a short-term decrease in turnover, but then it typically goes right back to where it is. I would ask, are those initiatives data-based? Are they being focused on the things that employees are telling us, or are they focused on the things that we think employees want? And again, are they really the things that are driving turnover? Our CEO and CFO don't look at cost of turnover. They consider it cost savings, but by not having to pay salaries for unfilled roles or delays in hiring. Lori, I feel sorry for you. That's not the way most CEOs and CFOs look at it, especially in large employers. I've worked with many employers that have talked about the millions of dollars that it costs in terms of cost of turnover, and they consider it to be a major business issue. You're just one of those unusual environments that actually sees it that way. All right, well, we've come up on an hour, and this hour is going by really, really fast. I want to thank everybody for joining today. If you want to contact us, you can reach us at 615-777-6400. If you want to have an individual discussion with me, which I love to do, feel free to reach out to me at DannyNelms@workinstitute.com. Certainly visit our website if you want to look at our retention report or any other of the great resources that we have. Feel free to visit our website and keep an eye and follow us on Twitter and follow us on LinkedIn for lots of good information that will continue to come out over the summer. Have a great week, everyone, and best of luck to you. Thanks so much.